Thanks for joining me for the Pray for Micah podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review, and check out my YouTube channel and follow me on social media. Pray for Micah Pod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And now, on with the show.
Welcome to the Pray for Micah podcast. And now your host, Micah Chrisman.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Pray for Micah podcast, where we explore art, activism, spirituality, and our cosmic significance/insignificance. I'm here with Michael Camp, and he's the author of Confessions of a Bible Thumper, Brewed Jesus, and his most recently released book, Breaking Bad Faith. Michael spent over 25 years as an ordained missionary, aid worker, and lay leader across various churches. He's actively participated in the 70s and 80s Jesus movement, engaging with Baptists, Charismatics, Calvinists, and assuming various leadership roles. Despite experiencing spiritual abuse and burnout, Michael's path took a transformative turn as he sought answers to the dilemmas of his evangelical worldview. Through rigorous historical research and scholarly exploration, he made startling discoveries that liberated him from harmful theologies, leading him to embrace a vibrant path rooted in reality, historical facts, and the compassionate way demonstrated by most mystics and social activists, as he believed Jesus exemplified. Michael's personal journey has inspired others on similar paths and now finds purpose in service-oriented organizations like Rotary International, where he spearheads humanitarian projects through village savings and loans groups in Tanzania and Uganda. And while no longer involved in traditional church settings, he recognizes the value of spiritual and service-oriented communities in fostering personal growth and making a positive impact. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Yeah, we were just talking about how we just happen to be on this, top ex-evangelical poll list when you Google ex-evangelical
that's
podcast.
Good news. Yeah.
And we're both just kind of like, we don't know how that happened, but we're happy we're there on that list. We're out here kind of doing the same mission, inviting guests and hosting folks on our shows. Yours, the Spiritual Brewpub, and mine, Pray for Micah. And yeah, it's just cool how it's like coming, it's all starting to connect as far as like we started following each other and like each other's posts, and it was like, oh, okay, yeah, we're on this kind of same spiritual faith journey of trying to explore and not just, and so that's why I tell people, I'm like, I don't necessarily want to be known as an ex-evangelical podcast. I'd rather focus on what is the positive reconstruction of what we're trying to see in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you're at, and that's what your novel, Breaking Bad Faith, is kind of trying to tackle too. It's like, let's address some of the harmful theologies and the myths associated with what's been perpetuated in our religious circles. But let's move on to also what outcome and hopefulness we're trying to see in the world in our spirituality and faith
definitely
practices.
Want to rebuild something that's positive and based on a good study of history.
Yeah, and I want to definitely get to that part too, because I'm sure you had a apologetics kind of framing that was given to you when you were doing your faith deconstruction, and it was always like, you can research the historical facts, but it has to always come back to this box of the Bible.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And this certain framework and view of how to interpret those historical truths. And then you're like, I don't know, for me, that was actually when my faith started to crumble. The more I was doing like this.
Research. Yeah. The reason is because they only let you ask safe questions and only go so deep. Don't go too deep now.
Right. Don't ask that question. Well, let's leave that curtain
No, you
drawn.
can't have any follow-up questions. Just very simple, safe questions only.
Right. Yeah. And so, I'm curious to learn more too, like what historical context and research you've done that's kind of informed your new book and also your kind of faith as a whole. So if you don't mind, just because our guests don't necessarily know who you are, some of them might, if they're in that kind of vein of content on the internet. But you're your book kind of outlines like 12 different major myths that are perpetuated and popular in theology and American culture. And we don't want to spill the tea. Everyone go buy the book. It just recently
Don't give
came
away
out.
the secret sauce.
Right. Gotta keep that secret sauce so people will come back for that barbecue,
Yeah.
But if you don't mind, Michael, just share a little bit of your background, because we kind of talked about in your bio, you're involved in the kind of the 70s, 80s Jesus culture, Jesus movement. But what are some of the top myths that, for you personally, when you started to look at those and unveil those, they kind of started you on that journey of deconstruction / faith reconstruction?
Right. Well, I'll start with just a little background on myself. I got involved in the evangelicalism through the Jesus movement in the 1970s when my mother joined the Baptist church down the street, got all excited. My dad followed her after a while. And, what they called the Jesus revolution that started in California, started moving to the East Coast. And I grew up in New England. And so I started meeting Jesus people. Our youth group took us to Explo 72. That's going to date me. I was a young teenager, went to Explo 72, which was a big Jesus festival in Dallas, Texas. And, there were Jesus folk rock bands. There was Billy Graham, Johnny Cash, Love Song. If you know any of the early Jesus musicians, and people were carrying around this book called The Late Great Planet Earth, and the rapture story was being taught, and your Jesus is coming back soon, and he's the answer to everything. And if you feel like you're wandering around in life and you don't know the meaning of life, this is the answer. We've got all the answers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of got into it that way. I didn't really commit my life, quote, commit my life to Christ until I was in college, my senior year or junior year, I should say. But I always had that in the back of my mind. I was always meeting people who were witnessing, and so when I had a kind of a life crisis in college, that was the direction I say, that must be where I should go to find answers. And so I ended up joining a Christian fellowship group in InterVarsity. I ended up started going to churches. And basically, I was very sincere. I kind of jumped in. I call it jumping in the deep end of the evangelical pool. And I actually, looked for the highest diving board and then dove in. I became very quickly, within a few years, I became a missionary to Muslims in Africa and joined a Christian aid agency. And, there were a lot of things. I always want to tell people there was a lot of things that were good in the evangelical movement that drew me in and draw everyone in. There's a sense of community. You have the answers to life's mysteries. You learn to love each other in the groups that you're with. In my case, I did have a vision to help poor people, which is not always the case with evangelicals. It's really more of a minority of people who do that. But so I ended up going overseas and working with a Christian aid agency. And so those are the good things that draw you in. But then after a while, you have these red flags go up, right? So what do you do when you land in the Horn of Africa and you meet these people from Ethiopia, Somalia, and they're Muslims, they're Oromos, the Somalis, and they've been Muslim in their tribe for centuries,
Right.
and you're trying to convert them, and you realize most of these people are not going to change. I mean, some will, a very few who were kind of nominal Muslims to begin with. Some of them just want to take advantage of you. Others might be sincere. And then you realize, wait a minute, what do I do with the doctrine of hell? So that was kind of like the first red flag I had. And I started deconstructing that, but I never went fully to deconstruct it because I was very aware that would get me in trouble if I went too far, right? So I kept a lot of these things quiet, and I didn't share it with very many people. But and then you go on and you realize that I got involved in some churches in California, and I realized there was spiritual abuse going on, and you start, all these red flags go up, and you say, wait a minute, that's not what I signed up for. Wait a minute, and you still think, I still thought that I had the ultimate reality. I mean, after all, Bob Dylan even got converted. I mean, that's the biggest sign of all, right? And so, you think you've got it all figured out because that's what they teach you in the evangelical bubble. But then one day you realize slowly, well, that's not right. And well, that's not right. And you're asking about some of the myths I go through in my new book, Breaking Bad Faith. Probably the biggest myth, doctrine of hell, was definitely one. So I kind of dealt with that light. I did light deconstruction of that, but I didn't go full on. I still believed in hell for some people. But probably the biggest one that that the granddaddy of doctrines to deconstruct is the belief in the infallibility of the Bible. So and that when you are able to give yourself permission to look at the Bible with new eyes, with the historical cultural context of the Bible in mind, understanding how the Bible was compiled, understanding how Jesus viewed the Bible in the first century, how the earliest students of Jesus viewed the Bible, how the Jewish people viewed the Bible. When you learn all that stuff, you realize that evangelicals view the Bible differently than the Jews, the earliest followers of Jesus, and Jesus himself.
Right. And then they didn't even have what we would call a Bible back then,
Right. They had scriptures, which just means writings. But
and they're like, we have these letters from this guy, Paul. We got a bunch of them over here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you start with the Old Testament, you have these sets of scriptures, but there was no definitive list of scriptures for the Old Testament until the 2nd century for the Jewish people. So in Jesus's day, it was very fuzzy boundaries for scripture. So you have the Torah. Almost everyone accepted the Torah, but people doubted what was in the Torah, wondering if that's really true, right? Like Jesus did. Jesus deconstructed parts of the Torah, and then you have the Sadducees only accepted the Torah. You have the Pharisees had their own oral tradition that they thought was on par with Scripture. You had the Greek Jews who had the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures, that had 14 books that they considered divine scripture that we don't find in our Protestant Bibles because we cut them out of that Bible. So, and then you have the Essenes that had a whole bunch of other scriptures that they thought were divine, and one of them, First Enoch, was quoted in the book of Jude, the New Testament book of Jude. So, long story short, scripture was fuzzy, and when you understand that, and also learn how the New Testament was compiled, it really opens your eyes to look at the Bible more historically, and you realize that there's a lot of myths around it.
So when you were doing your missions in Somali and working with Muslim communities, was there ever conversations where folks there were very adamant that no, the Quran is the spoken ultimate word of God?
Oh yeah.
And then you find yourself on that rabbit hole of trying to disprove their book, and then it makes you question, wait, how do I know my book's the truth, the ultimate truth? I don't know. There was times where I remember growing up where I was adamantly trying to proselytize a Mormon friend, and and I'm like thoroughly like destroying like Joseph Smith and just this is only a couple hundred years old and blah 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 blah. Never mind that I have the same basically fallacies or assumptions about my own faith. Like here I am talking about a guy walking on water, and this is truth, and I'm like, I know that there's historical differences and accuracies, whatever. One faith might be able to justify itself better than the other from a historical context as far as preserving their scriptures, and if it was just made up by Joseph Smith and his ilk, But I just remember like one day, talking to some atheist friend about this, deal, and he was like, your shit's just as bullshit as that. It's just like, no, but it's not. You see, like I have all these, and I started trying, and I realized I was doing the same thing my Mormon friend was doing, but just,
yeah, that's, you hit the nail on the head. That's very true. And yeah, Muslims would do the same. They would defend their Quran, and they had their own myths. They had their own thing, baggage that they had to carry around. And we're kind of both two religions are told that we've got the truth, and the others everyone else is wrong, right?
Right.
And the problem with that is that's what I call black and white, all or nothing thinking. Okay, so you're taught to believe your religion, your faith, your evangelical movement, your Bible is black and white, all or nothing. You either accept it and it's altogether true, and the Bible's altogether infallible and inerrant, or you just can't trust it at all. It's unreliable.
Right.
And so what I do in my writings is I talk about how that actually does not make any sense at all, because no one treats any book that way. No one treats anything that claims to be history that way. You might find some things that are complete bullshit. Like you might find something in maybe, I don't know, Joseph Smith's lit up tablets or something.
Right.
And you can probably prove that's, bullshit or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But as far as a historical document goes, we shouldn't approach the Bible as an all or nothing narrative, because like I said before, the Jewish people didn't treat it that way. Actually, the Bible critiques itself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can find things in the Bible that critiques other parts of the Bible. Jesus critiqued parts of the Torah. So you've got all these contradictions, you got all these different narratives. So let's treat it like any other book. What rises to the top, what sinks to the bottom. Remember, these are 40 or 50 authors writing this. It's not fair to condemn a whole set of authors by pointing to some other things you found. This is not true, and then condemning all the other authors. Well, what about what these other authors said? So let's treat it like we would any other piece of literature, and judge it in a way that's fair for all. But at the same time, let's not try to harmonize all these ugly things that we find in there.
Yeah, I just remember being blown away when in college. That was when my kind of faith deconstruction journey started. Like all my family would say, that was when I was corrupted. When I still in college started.
Yeah. You went to college. You didn't go to a Christian college.
I got all those liberal pollutants, still changing everything going on in my brain. But my pastor, and again, I was still involved in campus ministry, and we were kind of like the liberal campus ministry, and basically just like we were okay if you drank. We weren't like this very austere Baptist, group. We were kind of whatever, Church of Christ or whatever.
Right.
And but I remember my college pastor, Josh Casey, he's been on the show. He was the first time someone introduced me to the idea that what if we read Genesis like a poem, and just the beauty that illuminates from the creation story, which was just countercultural to the time, where everything was birthed out of gods clashing swords and stars came exploding, and I don't know, there's just all these different parallel tribes that had very violent origin stories to how it was created. And here was this kind of counter narrative poetry of like seeing it as beautiful. But like you said, we were given a set of criteria to hold the Bible, and it's unfair for the whole book. And like, what are the deeper truths in the metaphors than if we say, no, it was literally created in 7 days. And
exactly.
The animals were literally formed from dirt, and humans. And so I'm sure we could go on about, but it sounds like you actually had a journey where you delve into the historical aspects and uncovered some like scientific historical truths that helped you kind of clarify your understanding of faith. And so I don't know if you could share a little bit about what that historical research looked
Sure.
like and discoveries you made.
Yeah, well, I mentioned some of them when I talked about the historical, cultural context of the Bible and how the Bible was compiled. That's really huge. Okay, those two things. And what I mean that by cultural context is that if you read the Bible without any understanding of uh, what the culture and history, what was going on in the first century or whatever century that particular book was written, you're going to misunderstand all kinds of things. It'd just be like if someone, 1,000 years from now read, or 2,000 years from now, read something that we wrote without understanding our culture in the 21st century, they would misunderstand us. So that's the first thing. You got to get that down, and people aren't taught to read the Bible that way. They just say, "Oh, let's read it literally. It says it. God said it. That I believe it. That settles it." Well, that doesn't really work. So, and then the other part is to understand that there are mistranslations, and it's very common to have mistranslations in the texts. It doesn't mean like everything is mistranslated. It means there's a number of things that are mistranslated, and most of them, or many of them, are very important, right? And so that helps you understand, what narratives, what people like Jesus and Paul, what they really meant, and not just reading it and through our eyes. Now, there's a new book that I cite in my book. It's called After Jesus, Before Christianity. One of the authors is Hal Taussig, and what they say, and I follow this. I try to follow this the best I can. Is that you don't look at the history of Christianity through the lens of the present. Okay, if you look at it through the lens of the present, you're going to read into things that aren't there, right? So it's like if you tried to build a skyscraper and you start it with the observation deck. No, you start with the foundation. So if you get yourself in trouble when you do that, when you don't start with the foundation. And so that's really the point is and as far as the Bible goes, really understand the history and the culture, and whether there are mistranslations or not, so that we can understand what was being said back then. And like you mentioned, some of these things are not meant to be literal. They never were, because that's the way people wrote about things. And we have no obligation to assume that everything is literal in the Bible. So that would be the Bible as far as history goes. As far as the Bible goes, that would be what I would say about that. And then there's other things that we could talk about, the history. There's certain doctrines, for example, that evangelicals are taught are true, and I go, and these cover some of the myths that I go through. And if I think of another one, it might be the myth of the original depravity of man. Okay, original sin, right? So if you deconstructed that concept by going through history and what church fathers said, what the Western Church said, what Augustine said, what other church fathers said, what a few church mothers said, what the Eastern Church said, you will find there are varying opinions. But the majority opinion is that we're not originally depraved people, because the Genesis says that God created us and it was good.
Right.
So all of a sudden the Calvinists come along, or Augustine started it, I guess, and then the Calvinists, ran with it and said, "Oh no, you're a totally depraved worm of a man or woman, and God is really pissed off with you right from the start because of your sin, and the only solution is to accept Jesus' death on the cross, dying for your sins, and of course join our evangelical church, and
where we will continue to tell you how
sure
you're doing wrong, and you're
we're
also
right."
yeah,
So
that really contributes to that spiritual and trauma, like that kind of those
Right.
experiences of really dehumanizing you as a person and making you feel like you are rotten to your core, and the only way to get any ounce of goodness is to like pursue Jesus. And even then,
Right.
they say it's a gift that you are instantly washed and you're redeemed, but you have to continually prove that you have the fruits of the Spirit and that you have been
Exactly.
cleansed of this darkness.
Right.
And the old flesh still rises up every now and then. And so I'm curious, like, how did you reconcile with that idea of like, once you realize, man, maybe I'm not rotten to my core, and maybe God
Well,
does care and love
yeah,
about me?
I think the answer to that is, you when you deconstruct, at least in my experience was, I think I noticed some patterns before I deconstructed. I did light deconstruction on a lot of things, and then I noticed there were some patterns, and then I started to go in and do more deeper deconstruction. So the pattern here is fear-based faith, right?
Hmm.
You're set up to be afraid. You're a terrible person. You're on your way to hell. You got to be saved. And once you get saved, you got to stay in the church. You can't fall away, because if you fall away, I remember the first time I walked into a Assembly of God church, and the pastor was preaching on the possibility of falling away. They weren't Calvinists, okay? If they were Calvinists, they wouldn't preach that, right?
Right.
And I walked out of there totally just so afraid. I was like, oh my God, that can't be true, right? I have confidence that I'm going to go to heaven. Now he's saying anyone could fall away. And it was just fear-based faith, right? And so the people use that to get you to do stuff, right? So
Hmm.
that's the first thing. You see that pattern in all kinds of doctrines: doctrine of hell, original depravity, even the infallibility of the Bible, because there's all this crazy stuff in the Bible and you have to believe it. So it's fear. You get frightened of judgment and all kinds of things. So that would be one thing I would say about that. It's fear-based faith. And your question was, how did I get over that? Right?
Or how
Like,
did you deal with that, like, internal, like,
yeah,
was
like how did it?
it an identity, like, internal, like, acceptance of yourself that made, like, I'm actually not a horrible, decrepit
Right, right.
person?
So I mean, it's like, I think part of it is I never really. It's hard to explain, I guess, but because I think deep down I always thought, you know, uh, I'm not really that bad. I've got some problems and rough edges, and I need to clean up my act here and there. But I don't think I really believe that part. I think I always thought, yes, I needed to be saved, and yes, I could fall away and all that stuff. But I think deep down, a lot of people, a lot of us realize that kind of thing is really not true, because we don't usually live our life that way.
Right.
We don't think, oh, our cute little kids that we're raising are depraved, terrible people, and we
I don't know. I've seen some people's kids. There's
well,
some there are some, they make me think that there's no God sometimes. No.
yeah, right. Well, what happened was, like, I'll tell you a story. And one of the churches I attended, it was a charismatic church, and they believed in spanking kids. And
Mm.
so they taught you it's God's will that you spank your children. You got to drive their strong will out of them, and they have to have instant obedience to whatever you say, right? So if you do that, right, no kid naturally does that, because they're kids.
Right.
You got to be patient with them. You got to instruct them. You got to, and so I remember one time going over to someone's house at 11 o'clock in the morning, and someone in the church, and their kids were acting up. And so one of the parents ran and said, "Oh, excuse me, I'm going to have to spank Johnny here." And I just was observing. And then the other spouse said, "Oh yeah, that's like the fourth or fifth time that he's been spanked this morning." And
Wow.
I was a conservative Christian who believed in spanking and spanked my children, and I was shocked. I was like, "You're kidding. You've
Isn't that like
spanked
borderline
5
abuse?
times this morning and it's not even noon?
Wow.
What the hell are you doing?"
Poor kid.
I
They're gonna
don't
grow up and have some. They're gonna be on someone's show.
Yeah, right. And so I always say, you know what? That's what, when you're in the evangelical bubble, you can always find someone more conservative than you.
Mm,
And then you think, I'm not so bad because I'm not as conservative as these fundies or these people. That's kind of the rationality you take. But anyways, I think to answer your question, there comes a time when you deconstruct these things where you realize, no, wait a minute. Um, this is not even historical. I mean, the Eastern Church basically says, yeah, you've got a damaged eye, let's say, but your eye is not destroyed. You can find God on your own. You don't have to, you're spiritually immature, just like you're physically immature. You have to grow up spiritually. That's all it is. It's not a kind of you're totally depraved and lost forever unless you jump through these religious hoops. So when you get that, then you realize, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, all it is just that none of us is perfect, and we all know that's true.
right.
It's much easier to accept when you see that.
Yeah. Somehow humans are able to give more understanding, compassion to each other than our God, who allegedly sacrificed his son to save us
Right,
from our depravity, but
right,
only to a certain extent. And you
right.
were talking about Calvinism earlier, and you'll appreciate this joke. I think I've said this before on the show. I saw this shirt once. It said, Calvinism, no lives matter.
No life
No
matter.
lives matter. Oh, God just kind of picks and chooses who goes to heaven, so no one matters.
Right, right. Yeah, that's
But this,
right. Yeah,
but this touches on like the overarching, like a big theme that your book actually is trying to address, which is the idea of violent sacrificial religion. And you're talking
yeah,
about that
right,
the idea of a punitive God needing to be necessary, the necessity for hell in a place that will punish people, and for the people who did wrong to us, so we can see retribution, and we can see that that's the only way we can have justice in the world,
right.
versus a life of what Jesus is trying to offer, a path of peace. And so I'm curious if you could just dive in a little bit, explain how do you look at, like, what does that violent sacrificial religion mean, and how do you feel like these ancient mystics and social activists following in Christ's path were trying to be a counter voice to that.
Right, exactly. Well, yeah, so I think the thing to look at is you take all the violent narratives that you find in the Bible, okay? Most of them are in the Old Testament. There might be a few in Revelation and maybe Second Thessalonians, but most of them are in the Old Testament, right? And you just take a look at those violent narratives, and you'll notice a pattern. And people like Rene Girard, who kind of studied ancient, violent, sacred, religion, also noticed that pattern and started writing about it, and finding out that this thing that we call violent sacrificial religion is just woven right into the fabric of the Jewish tradition. Not all of the tradition. Now, there are some restorative narratives in there too, but that's why I call it, and many people call it, the two-faced God. Evangelicals believed in a two-faced God, the retributive God who gets angry and wants to punish, send people to hell, institute the death penalty, all these things, and then the restorative God that Jesus and many of the prophets talked about. So, but when you realize there's narratives about the retributive God, you can see, like, for example, Noah's flood story. God gets so pissed off at people that he drowns the whole planet except for one family. You have to think about that. That includes children, infants, and the unborn were drowned. So this God was not even pro-life, you know.
Right.
And then you've got the Canaanite conquest, book of Joshua, where God says expressly, go back and read it, I am not going to have mercy on these people. Do not make a peace treaty with them, because I'm not having mercy. As a matter of fact, I'm hardening their hearts, so they won't they're going to stay the way they are, and I won't have mercy on them. And so, he tells the Israelites to destroy them all, which includes non-combatants, the elderly, women, children and the unborn.
Hmm.
Right. And so then you see some other things in there. This guy named Achan disobeys God and takes the spoils of war in Joshua chapter 7. And what happens is that uh, God says, hey, this guy disobeyed me. Find out who it is and destroy him and all his possessions. And so that's what they did. They found the guy. He actually confessed his sin. Seemed like he was repentant, but didn't matter. They stoned him and his children. See, sometimes they throw in, like at the flood story in the Canaanite conquest, they throw in some innocent people, right?
Hmm.
And so they're stoned, burned, and destroyed. So the pattern here is this, and there's 5 things I could tell you. One is there's a problem. When there's a problem that damages the relationship with God or the gods, because this kind of pattern you can find in pagan ancient religions,
Right.
Too, right? So when there's a problem that causes a damage to the relationship with the deity, it could be like in Noah's time, he said, "Oh, they're so evil. That's all they think about." So it's just practicing evil. It could be disobedience, like this guy Achan, or it could be, when he institutes the death penalty for all these things. You're disobedient. You didn't obey me on these things, so we're gonna execute you. Or it could be just an offense, like
Hmm.
someone hit someone and took their eye out. Well, they got to get their eye out, right?
Right.
So that's number one. There's a problem that happens. And then number 2, God's angry over the problem. He's angry over the sin. He has hatred for the people who have sinned. And then the third thing is these guilty people are dehumanized. Okay,
Hmm.
the people of time of Noah's flood, they're so evil. They're just terrible people. They're not really human. Doesn't matter. We can kill them. The Canaanites, they're so evil. They're not really human. We can just kill them, right? These
Hmm.
disobedient people, they've been so bad. We can just execute them or punish them in some way. So that's the third thing. And then the fourth thing about this violent sacrificial religion is that the people kind of become like a scapegoat. Okay, we have someone to blame, right? We've dehumanized them. Let's scapegoat them, and then we will, uh, do something to eliminate that person or group of people, and then the problem will go away. And then
Hmm.
number 5, what do you have to do to punish them? It's usually has something to do with violence or either physical or psychological. So you got, uh, capital punishment. You've got eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You know, uh, you knock someone's eye out, then their eye has to come out. Life for life. Um, you've got only and in all these cases, only violence can solve the problem, right?
Hmm.
And so that's violent sacrificial religion, and you can see it in so many stories in the Old Testament, and you can see it the way people view the atonement. Evangelicals view the atonement, so that in the atonement, there's a problem. We're all sinners. We're all going to hell. So we're dehumanized. We're all deserve to go to hell, right? And what's the solution to the problem? Violence. You got
Hmm.
to torture and murder this innocent person named Jesus. And then if you accept that narrative, then God will save you from hell. So, I mean, that's violent sacrificial religion.
Hmm.
So, I mean, that's kind of it in a nutshell. And uh, you don't notice this at first, but when you kind of think about it and really examine it and give yourself permission to say, okay, I just read this thing in the Bible and I can actually identify that this thing is ugly.
Yeah.
There's something in this thing that doesn't sit right with me or screams at me that this is wrong. and then you can start to really deconstruct it. But that's what people are taught. They can't go there. They can't look at the Joshua narrative or the Noah story that way, or there's something wrong with them, right? Because that would mean the Bible is not infallible, that God really isn't like that. So, but on the other hand, when you identify the violence and the sacred violence that's going on, you can also see that the counter myth, those are the myths. The counter myth is the restorative God. And you can actually see that in Genesis, in the book of and the story of Joseph. Because what happens to Joseph, Joseph's enemies, his brothers who try to kill him and then sell him into slavery, there's no retribution.
Yeah.
Right? They get restored. So you can see it, some of it in the Old Testament, but you see some of it in the prophets. And then you see Jesus really flesh it out, the restorative narratives, where the answer is not violence. The answer is nonviolent love for enemies and restoration.
Yeah, I remember, I don't know where I read this or heard this, but this idea that rather than looking at Jesus's death on the cross as like this atonement, like you're saying, it's a blood sacrifice that
Right.
has to be spilt for everybody, but it was because he was a scapegoat, right? I mean, with the
Right.
historical context, with the Roman rule and everything, it was like, well, before we get an uprising, we should just kill this religious rebellious leader and let's scapegoat our problems onto this person. But seeing his death as more of like this call, this end to end death, to end
Right.
the death
Right.
of, let my death be the thing that, like, all right, let's stop killing, and like this whole sacrificial
Right.
cycle that we find ourselves in.
Right.
I say that, but then you got stories like Ananias and Sapphira, who God just strikes down dead for not giving all their money.
Right. There are some things
So
like that. That's correct.
it's funny how people will like, well, it's all in the Old Testament. I'm like, well, if you read the New Testament, God,
It can be there too. Right.
he struck some people dead just for not giving all of the money that they
Right.
had given to
Right.
the. So I don't know. That's where like it's still, yeah. And I'm
Yeah,
guessing.
and I understand that. But I guess there's a tradition to read. One of the main traditions in Eastern Christianity and some of the minority streams in Western Christianity, like the Anabaptists and some others, probably the Moravians, but is to read the Bible through the lens of Jesus's love ethic, right? And so if you do that, you could say, hey, you know what? I just found something that it seems like it contradicts what Jesus said over here. So what are you going to choose, right? You know, is God really retributive, or is he restorative? And I think the restorative narratives are beautiful and the retributive narratives are ugly, and they do not, I don't think that's what Jesus, I mean, I don't see Jesus doing that. I know people try to make him do that, you know, like when he went into the temple and he threw everyone
Right.
out, to say that was violent. Well, it wasn't really violent. You need a whip to get the animals to get out, but he wasn't whipping people. You know, he was just driving out the animals in the marketplace and telling people to leave. So I don't see any evidence of that he was really violent. So, you know, I know there's a debate about that, but that's good. Let's have a debate about it, you know?
Right. And when you look at his life as a whole, he's constantly, combating any kind of, arguments, or like, I mean, half the time he slips through crowds that are trying to like stone him, and
Well,
like
yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just like
And
these miraculous kind of moments,
right,
but it's like he didn't get his disciples and say, all right, defend me, make a circle around me,
right,
he just quietly slips out the back door, so to
right.
speak.
And the reason why they were doing that was because their heroes were people like Joshua, you know, who killed the
Mm-hmm.
Canaanites and killed Achan, or this other guy named Phineas in Numbers 25, who drove a spear through two idolaters. Those were their heroes.
Hmm.
right? So if they found some Jewish person who was getting too close to what they would call heresy or idolatry, well, what do? You just like just like these other people. They weren't thinking about the Joseph narrative. They were thinking about those people were thinking about the Joshua or the Phineas narratives.
Hmm.
So they were trying to kill Jesus, right?
Right.
So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, he did not. There's no evidence that he tried to defend himself with weapons. That it
Right.
was always slipping through, or it's not his time. But I think he probably knew that, hey, I'm rocking the boat a lot, so it's just a matter of time when they're probably going to kill me.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, Michael, as far as like you've talked about this path of peace and this kind of faith deconstruction journey to basically see the lens of the world or look at it through this idea of like I said, the way the mystics or social activists would see it as like the good news as being like you know good news for the poor and uplifting our fellow man who's been oppressed. I'm curious, like what then is when those folks who are in that traditional fundamentalist kind of worldview, because it sounds like you still have this like deep faith and connection to God and Christ, and so what, I mean, for lack of better words, what is your eschatology of what happens to us after we die? Like, do you
Right.
believe there is a hell that some people go to? In your book you kind of started to mention that um the Greek word, that I can't remember, koinos, or I don't know.
Yeah. Aeonis Colossus. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
where it talks about like basically this, we interpret it as eternal, but it actually wasn't. It was a short time of whatever, a trial period. And so I guess I'm just curious, what has, in your faith perspective, in your faith deconstruction and reconstruction, what makes you want to stay and even trying to resolve these issues within the
Yeah.
arena of Christianity? Like, why not just throw it all out the window? And
Well, there's a couple of things to say about that. First of all, I'll preface my answer by saying Christianity is a loaded term, and when I talk about Jesus, when I make a case for Jesus in the first century, that's not Christianity.
mm-hmm.
Christianity has gone so far away from most of Jesus' teachings that it's just like, I don't think Christianity has a leg to stand on, really.
Yeah.
I mean, we could cite some exceptions, people who still call themselves Christians, and they're much more restorative and they follow Jesus, maybe, but and that's fine. I accept that, but I think it's perfectly acceptable to start talking about this way of life that Jesus taught outside of Christianity altogether. Okay. Because Christianity is a loaded term and it just doesn't mean anything anymore because so much of it is corrupt.
Hmm.
So it's not all corrupt, yeah, but so much of it is. I think we have to get out of that box. So let's see. Your question was.
Sorry, I know I kind of do that sometimes.
That's
I'll
all
have
right.
a
My fault.
paragraph
Got
question that goes, I guess I just relating to you personally, like, what do you think happens to you when you die?
Yeah,
Do
right,
you personally feel like you will get to go to a
right,
transcendent place that maybe doesn't look like heaven as
right.
the evangelical Christian worldview would offer?
Yes, right.
Um,
Well, I think from my study of history, um, my conclusion is that, and this is historically grounded, is that the earliest students of Jesus, they did not believe in hell. They they believed, they were universalists.
hmm,
They believed that somehow, some mysterious way, people would be all restored or reconciled to God, and that God will win, love will win,
hmm,
and Jesus is Lord of all, and he gets his way, and he loves his enemies, and so his enemies will finally come around.
hmm,
Right. So that's what the earliest students of Jesus taught. The doctrine of hell was a very minority view, and probably didn't really get any legs until I think Augustine. And I guess there's one school of theology that taught it, and I think that was Augustine's school. But until then, it was just a weird doctrine that was out there somewhere that didn't start in the Old Testament. It started in books like First Enoch, which the Essenes believed in, and so anyways, the doctrine of hell, when you deconstruct it, it wasn't what Jesus taught. So as far as the afterlife goes, I mean, it's a mystery, but I think that I would say that I would believe that, and let's just say if you took that phrase eternal punishment and you translated it in a much better way, it would come out to be, and this is the way that the source New Testament translates it, it would come out to be rehabilitation for a set period of time, or rehabilitation of the age. So that word that's translated eternal is really a word that just means a period of time. And that period of time, you can find that same word describing periods of time that are as little as 3 days and as much as, whatever, a lifetime or whatever, So it's not eternity, right? So it's like, I don't know. It's a mystery to me, but I know that I believe that there is something in the afterlife, that God is love, and that we will be all restored in some way. But some people, probably the very evil people, will have to go through some kind of rehab because they're so warped, but that's a restorative thing. It's not a retributive thing. It's not like, oh, we're going to punish you in the fire of hell until you finally change.
Right.
So I don't know how that happens, but I can tell you stories how it happens now. So yeah. I mean, I got stories like that in the book.
Yeah, one could argue that we don't even know what if we're in that rehabilitative phase right now in this human experience. Maybe this is not hell in the classical definition sense, but how do I know that I haven't already died, and this life I'm living out right now is a path that's trying to correct me back towards the source of goodness of God,
No, I that makes perfect sense to me, because when Jesus talked about the end of the age, he wasn't talking about the end of the world. He was talking about the end of the age, and really historically that meant the end of the second temple religion of the Jewish people, because he was always talking about in the Jewish context. So if you think of it that way, then we're in that next age right now, right? And people can go through rehabilitation in this life just as much as in the afterlife, and maybe most of it's in this life. We don't know,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I've not explored too much about Eastern philosophies as far as Buddhism or Hinduism when looking at reincarnation, but they would pose, I guess, to some extent, that if we are here in a human experience, we've done a pretty good job in past lives of trying to move closer towards enlightenment, closer towards to be in a conscious state of.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just our human egotism to think that we're these higher life form beings to get this chance of reincarnation. But the point is to get out of that cycle. So I guess that was a kind of like weird, kind of trippy thought I was thinking about, was like this idea that what if I'm actually living a reincarnated version of Micah that is in this cycle of rehabilitation that's trying to move closer towards.
Yeah.
Hey, did I live a selfish life? Did I harm a lot of people?
Right.
Okay, I need to do that again.
I think that concept, though, is retributive, in my opinion.
That's true.
It's like, so if you didn't measure up, well, then we're going to have to put you through some more suffering.
You got to come back as an ant now.
Yeah, right. You got to go right. So I don't think that's restorative at all. So I would reject things like that. But you understand why people come up with these things. They're trying to explain human existence,
Exactly.
and it's fine. All of us do that, you know. But I think if you learn the beauty of the restorative narratives, I think those kinds of things, those kinds of ideas fall by the wayside.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I had a friend who um I can't remember what sect of Buddhism he was in, but they we had very similar kind of language as far as like back when I was more of traditional Christian, I guess you could say.
Hmm. Hmm.
This idea that I've already am redeemed versus trying to accept, and there was like this idea that we're technically all already enlightened, and it's just
Yeah.
unraveling and opening up our spirits
Right.
to see that. And it was just kind of a beautiful kind of parallel, like, wow, I didn't realize that, but it was like
Yeah.
there's again, it's even
Yeah.
Buddhism has its own sects
Yeah.
and
No, there
different
are plenty.
divisions of, well, this one
Right.
you have to earn enlightenment, this one you already have it, you have
Right.
to unveil it.
I know, but I mean, I haven't just studied Buddhism, but I know that I respect a guy named Marcus Borg, and he said there's a lot of wisdom in Buddhism and Buddha's teachings. But I mean, just that whole concept that we have what it takes to find enlightenment. Let's say we just don't. We're just not aware of it, and so becoming spiritually mature is when you become aware that, oh, okay. Um, I'm good. I'm not depraved. I'm acceptable. I just need to realize that, and then start to try to grow spiritually. I don't have to jump through these religious hoops
Hmm.
or believe certain doctrines in order to find that find a tap into the divine. So I kind of, that makes sense to me, and I think even Jesus's teachings fits that too. Because when he said you had to be born again, he first said to see the kingdom of God. It's an epiphany that comes like oh, there it is. It's been here the whole time. I just
Hmm.
haven't seen it.
Right.
you know,
Yeah, isn't it somewhere in Luke he says the kingdom of God is within all men,
right? The kingdom of God is within you, among you. It's and you don't like, it's not something you go, oh, there it is over there. It's all around. You just don't see
Mhm.
it, right.
So can you share, like, for any listeners or folks who are kind of on that faith deconstruction journey, because we talk about how that the power of that narrative, right? The power of that, like, forced narrative, I should say, and that safety of community. And it's hard to um, look beyond necessarily the list of doctrines that have been laid out before you. And so for any of those folks who are on that kind of same faith deconstruction journey, to realize, like, hey, Christianity's had a bad rap or a bad name that they've created, and there's actually a whole life-giving version of this faith that's here waiting for you,
Hmm.
but you have to be willing to throw away some dogma to the side.
Right, right, right.
So, how do you what words of advice or of consolation would you give folks who are on that journey, who maybe are curious and they're wanting to explore beyond what the shell of faith that has been given to
Right.
them, but that family or that that church or that
Yeah,
community, it's so strong that they're just terrified, and
yeah,
it becomes like it's an identity thing. It's like, well, it's like you said, those folks in Somalia or who are Muslim, like, well, if I do this and I am a devout, I'm going to lose everything,
yeah, yeah. It's fear. I mean, I guess the first thing is to encourage people that it's a good thing to question your faith. That's not a bad thing. I think that's one of the things that evangelicals teach you. It's not a good thing to question your faith, or only have very simple, safe questions.
Mhm.
Right. So it's a good thing to question your faith. And if something doesn't make sense to you, that's fine. That's good. Okay. Jesus said, love God with all your mind. So use your mind, and logic and reason is not a bad thing. Questions are not a bad thing. And if you find contradictions, conflicts in scripture or doctrines or whatever, good, identify them and try, learn more about them. Learn if that, where that came from. So I think that's the first thing. And then the other thing is history is the key for me. I mean, um, if you learn, let's say you're doubting the Bible, or you think, boy, this makes sense. I have always struggled with this. I need to deconstruct this. Well, just learn things like the history of how the Bible was compiled, the history of how the Jewish people and Jesus and the earliest church viewed the Bible, and that history will open up your eyes, because history is not an exact science, but it's works in the realm of probabilities, and you can learn through studying history without bias. Look at everything equally, and see what really makes sense historically, that has the most evidence, and you can see what's most probably true, and then what's most probably not true. And sometimes you can find out what's certainly true and what's certainly not true. So, that kind of opens up your mind. And then I would say, find some other people who are doing the same thing, because you need support, because there's all those voices in your mind that come back to haunt you. Like you were saying, the church is saying this, or your family's saying this, and you just need to go to find other people. I still find so much value in that. I started a evangelical deconstruction support group here in Seattle, and we're starting to get together. We've gotten together twice in person, and maybe 4 or 5 times altogether when you count the Zoom calls. But it still blows my mind every time I hear someone's story. I go, wow, I know exactly what you're talking about. Half or 2/3 or 3/4 of what you said happened to me. And man, I'm so glad you shared that. It's just encouraging. That you're on the right track when you meet people who are going through the same thing, and you hear their stories, and that helps you know that you're not going crazy, you're normal, and there's something here that you need to stay on this path.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shock to anyone's system when, like I said, I was as early as 4 years old when I learned about hell,
Oh,
and
that's terrible.
and
Teaching kids hell is just absolutely crazy. We didn't do that. My wife and I did not do that, but we spanked our kids, but we didn't teach them about hell. So yeah. So when we deconstructed, well, my wife had never deconstructed as much as I have, but when we kind of started, deconstructing or stepping back, we didn't have to go back to our kids. We had to go, sorry, we didn't spank you, but we didn't have to say, sorry, we taught you that you're going on your way to hell.
right. Yeah, at that young of age, you mean there's a place where I go forever and I'm tortured by demons and
Oh my
fire and flames?
God.
Like, yeah, I don't want that. Yeah, I'll pick Jesus over here.
Yeah, right.
Every single time I'll pick Jesus. Yeah.
It's easy to get into the church that way. Yeah. Of course I'll pick Jesus. I'm just a 4-year-old kid. What do I know?
Right. Yeah, I mean, there was also the follow-up with on God loves you and you want to be with God anyways. But yeah, just interesting how just so much, over the last 10 years, pretty much since, college and up till now I'm 34. There's just still that voice in the back of my head, like you're saying, that there's part of me that's like, what if I got it wrong? What if
Yeah.
God really does hate all gay people and we're,
Right.
and et cetera. And I'm,
Right.
and I, at the end of the day, I'm always, I'm thankful in my, ability now to just see outside of that voice and to kind of call that trauma child in
Yeah.
and
Right.
say, hey, it's okay. You may not have all the answers. But your faith and your journey now is more reflective of the love you want to see in the world. And that's what you need to lean into.
Right.
And if I go to heaven and God's like, yep, nope, actually I did kill all those people in the flood and I hate babies sometimes. And sometimes I kill gay people and I drop dead people and you chose against this. All right. Then I'll just be like, well, I guess I wasn't meant for this heaven anyways. So
Right. Well, I mean, like I say, if that's all true, if the evangelical two-faced God is true, we are all in deep shit.
yeah.
Because I mean, that's not the kind of God that anyone really deep down knows they don't want to, have that kind of God in the world. So, I mean, I understand people have fears, and those voices keep coming back, and I've had to struggle with them. That just keep on keeping on, doing the things, studying history, giving yourself permission to ask questions, getting in community, and you'll find that, especially when you get, at least that's for me, I'm kind of analytical, so that,
Mm-hmm.
learning the history, like learning that Christian universalism was the majority view for like 400 or 500 years. That's
Yeah.
that's it's outrageous. It's like, what? Why didn't anyone tell me this? Where, learning what the real translation of eternal punishment is, or whatever.
Hmm.
Those are the kinds of things that help you. At least it helped me to get more grounded. Say, okay, now I can have more confidence in this, and then also, when you really get outside, and when you really give yourself permission to question things, you realize, oh my God, this is disgusting. This theology of hell. I mean, this is
Hmm.
disgusting to think that, even I mean, we don't live life that way. We don't go around thinking, yeah. I mean, the pro-life movement is just a great example. I mean, the hypocrisy of saying, yeah, we're pro-life, but then they're pro-death penalty. They're,
Right.
they might even be pro-tough on crime. They might even have concealed carry weapons because they want to take down a bad guy with a gun if they have to.
Hmm.
And they believe in the doctrine of hell, and, 3/4 of the human race is going to be in eternal conscious torment, which is not pro-life, by the way.
Hmm. Right. Far from it. In
It's
fact,
just
it's
crazy.
pro death for eternity.
It's
Death,
pro-death. It's pro-suffering
suffering.
for
Yeah.
eternity. I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, it's just torture for eternity. I mean, and this is what people believe.
Yeah. And I think part of the mysticism, or the tantalizing carrot, so to speak, of an eternal afterlife, both for bad people and good people, is it means I can put less weight into my life I work on here and now. Like you were saying, like if you're in some evangelical worldviews, I'm not so concerned about the poor, because I might justify, well, the flesh is weak and we all die and we all are
Right,
gonna
right,
go.
right.
It's better to focus on the soul, and so I've been
Yeah,
in
right, right.
places where they won't even let the houseless folks who come into their kitchen eat until they hear a 30-minute sermon, you know,
Oh, yeah, right.
to
The soup
keep them
kitchens, right.
right. And
Right.
so I'm curious, because I know you're not really affiliated with any kind of or in traditional church settings. Maybe you are. I guess I just based
No,
on
I'm
what.
not. I'm not anymore.
And
Mm-mm.
so
Done. I'm
how
done with church.
you're done with church. And I just know that you do stuff with the Rotary International. So I was curious if you could share, like, so how does that inform your faith still? How does your
Yeah,
faith
yeah. Well,
inform your activism in the
right.
communities that you serve?
Well, I think that we, when we come out of the evangelical bubble, and even the society as a whole has been taught this, that, you're thinking in terms of, um, God. If you're a spiritual person, if you're a religious person, you're involved in some kind of religious institution. Okay, church, or, Catholicism, Protestantism, the evangelical movement. Yeah, and you're faithful. You go to church all the time and you believe certain things. Well, when you deconstruct all that stuff, most people discover that what matters most is just loving other people.
Hmm.
Love is what matters most. Love your neighbor, love your enemy. Oh, by the way, who said that? Oh, that's right. Jesus said that. Oh, that's right. We haven't.
Uh, taps the brain a little bit,
Yeah, right, right. So, I mean, even Jesus told stories about people who were, the Samaritan. Who was the Samaritan? He didn't believe the right things, but
Right.
he was the hero of the story. All he did was love someone who needed help, and then the sheep and the goats. Who was the heroes of those stories? The people who love someone who are poor, oppressed, the least of these, and they didn't even know that they were doing it for Jesus. And Jesus said, "Oh yeah, you're doing it for me." right? You're following me. And they didn't
Yeah.
even know it. So I think that's the thing. That's the thing. That's the answer. Love is what matters. Loving other people, including your enemies, because that's very important for restorative justice. I think that's one of the key things and one of the geniuses of Jesus' teachings. And when you do that, that's all that matters. You know, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's interesting to talk about what you believe in, the deity of Christ, the Trinity, how do you treat the Bible? All those are very interesting things that I think we should talk about, but it doesn't matter as much as just love. So that's really my answer to that is just focus on what matters most. And for me, the Rotary organization, it's a service organization. The motto is service over self. They have an ethic of integrity and doing things that are beneficial to everyone concerned, and doing service projects for your community and all over the world. I'm involved in the World Community Service Committee on our club, and we do, because of our connections with other clubs and NGOs, other organizations, we do projects all over the world. And I focus on Tanzania and Uganda, but so you can join a community or an organization or a nonprofit, and it could be a church too. I'm not saying that you shouldn't go to church. I'm just saying whatever you do, find a community where they make love what matters most, and making the world a better place, and thinking about how to what are the needs of people who are oppressed or marginalized or sick or whatever, and focus on helping those people, and equalizing, making an egalitarian community, treating everyone equally, etc. And if you do that, it doesn't matter if you're in a religious organization or not in a religious organization. You could be an atheist for all I care.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, those folks aren't exempt from
What's that?
I say, yeah, those folks aren't exempt from necessarily the worldview of like what you're talking about. Like,
No, not at all. Yeah,
everyone's called to love people, and
yeah,
if you do that through your faith as a Muslim, you do that through your,
and
X, Y, and Z.
I give like 3 or 4 examples in my book. So I'm not going to give you the secret sauce.
Give us one of them.
I'll give you one of them. But basically, the first half of the book goes through the myths and how they're tied to retribution and violence. And then the second half of the book goes through the restorative narratives and why the path of peace, I make the case, is a superior path. And you don't have to be Christian. This is not a Christian thing necessarily, but you can be. Yeah, it's just
sure.
But I give the 4 examples, and there's other examples I give too that are done by Christians, but these 4 are not done by Christians per se. They're just done by people, or in one case, the country of Norway, how they treat prisoners. But the one example I always like to give is this Muslim couple. They're leaders in a mosque, and some guy comes in to the mosque one day, and he hates Muslims. He's an American white guy who was an Iraq War veteran, who's been taught to hate Muslims because he fought in Iraq, and he finds a mosque in his hometown when he returns, and he's so pissed off he wants to set a bomb in the mosque and kill a lot of Muslims. So long story short, the Muslims who realize there's something off about this guy, they still love him, show him dignity, invite him over for dinner, show him hospitality, and he ends up converting to Islam.
Wow.
All that, and becoming a leader in the mosque. And so I just given away the secret sauce for that story, but
well, that's a beautiful, thank you. Wow, what a powerful story that is.
Yeah, and there's even a documentary about it called Stranger at the Gate. You really should Google it and watch it. It's only 30 minutes long. It just blows you away. So those are the kinds of things I try to bring up, because it opens your mind to think, oh yeah, you got to look at it a different way, right? You got to get outside this religion box. And even though Islam is a religion, the love ethic can flow through that just as much as any other religion or non-religion.
And how that truth is maybe salient throughout other faiths, but it's all tied to the same source. And so that's why I like when folks in my past, people in my past, the interpretation of when Jesus says narrow is the way.
Oh, right.
They're thinking it's only Jesus,
Yes.
But when you're sharing that story, I'm like, that's a narrow path. Someone, a community who is loving somebody in their faith that's not even Christian.
Yeah.
And they can, in that journey, any kind of redemption stories like that, like to me, like you're saying, this path of peace, that is the narrow way. It is a harder truth.
Yeah, it is a narrow way, but it doesn't mean everyone else is going to hell.
Right.
It just means you're not gonna get destroyed by violence if you follow this narrow way.
Right.
You're gonna. I mean, you might have to lay down your life. So there's people might be violent towards you, but it's not going to be, your own destruction by fighting others and trying to solve the world's problems through retribution and violence. It's a way that has the potential to save the world, and in many ways it has when we finally open our eyes to it.
Yeah, and I've definitely had to fight the whole growing up white savior complex of wanting to use my faith to save thousands of people. And even in my faith deconstruction journey, and I kind of got into the anti-racism kind of movement, and I still think that work's very important and powerful, but I had to kind of take a step back and do some self-reflection. It's like, is this still kind of like my religious propensities, telling me I'm trying to be this white savior, trying to go into these circles to try to be the good white ally and this and that, and yet still just how much you come to realize that there's this goodness that we all have intrinsically in us, and that we want to see our fellow neighbor, we want to see justice in the world, and not to see people suffer.
Yeah, that's all it should be. Right.
How, hey, if I'm going to die, whether it's tomorrow or 40 years from now, how can I live my life, like you said, in service of others? And really, it's more of, it's less about trying to save the world and like, hey, can Micah save himself at the end of the day? Can I find the love and healing in myself that then spills out? And that relates to when I understand, the powers and principalities of the air, which is like, the racism, the systemic oppression, the things that perpetuate in our culture, to me are like the actual sins of our government and agencies. And you kind of started to touch on it in your book, the fallacies of, the religious fundamentalism, having to get behind people like Trump and portray him as a prophet, and the kind of bolstering of that, cult movement, I want to call it, the religious right, religious right being bolstered. When you start to see all that, the systems of how these things are perpetuating, and how these people who proclaim to have a love for the world and are, like you said, the pro-lifers who will also be the ones who want to cut SNAP benefits and want to cut other government service, money.
Right.
I'm on a tangent now. Sorry, you're just here for my soapbox rant, but I'm just like, I guess you come to realize, like, hey, we have so much good we can do in the world. We could be Christ and love to each other, and that means seeing it outside of the faith construct and realize it's here giving this cup of water. It's here showing up to that protest to stand against police brutality. It's here when I help face racial reconciliation for the communities and churches that I've been that had no black people in it, and we all have. And so you just kind of start to realize, like, it starts to make sense as far as like what Christ's message really has and the power it has in the world of healing itself and ourselves individually. If we can look beyond the dogma of what race, class, gender, all these, things that we've created as normalcies in our world, in our cultures, in our churches, and keeps us segregated, keep us separate.
No,
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, Michael. Thanks for coming to it. Oh, no. I appreciate you hearing me on my tangent.
No, that's fine. No, preach it, brother.
So for your um did you get very deep in during the whole pandemic and the politics of Trump? Like, I don't know how that would have looked in your service organization, the Rotary International, but was there, I don't know, was your involvement in that?
Well, I think the Rotary kind of attracts more progressive people because it's open and affirming. It's gay
Mhm.
people are accepted. It's socially progressive, but a service oriented. So there are some Christians in the club, and there are actually some clubs that actually pray before they start their meeting. But believe me, our club would never do that. We would just say, no, we can't do that.
Hmm.
Most clubs have nothing to do with religion, but it's not that we're anti-religion. So if one club wants to do that, then it's their prerogative. They just can't, they just have to deal with it themselves. But yeah, I mean, we have to think of the world in a different way and start thinking about what matters most, and focus
Absolutely.
on that.
And I know you've got your own podcast and you're kind of on this journey. You have guests and folks on and to kind of share about what does this faith journey look like for us now. And so I'm curious if you could just share a little bit about what was your vision behind Spiritual Brewpub and the
Oh,
topics
good.
and the episodes, like, yeah, just like your origination behind that, starting that kind of online kind of community.
Yeah. So what happened was during my deconstruction, um, some friends of mine, we all like to drink beer. So we decided to hang out in pubs and microbreweries, and there's a lot of good ones here in the Pacific Northwest, and talk about theology and help deconstruct together while we're having a couple of brews. And so we started doing that on a regular basis. So that's where I got the name, the Spiritual Brewpub. It's a place where you can let your hair hang down and be honest. You don't have to feel like you're in the confines of some church that is telling you what you're supposed to believe, that kind of an idea. So, and then on my podcast, I'm just trying to find people to interview who have deconstructed. Most of them have deconstructed evangelicalism, but I try to find some unique stories, unique people who have unique stories to tell. And so um, I've had people who have, just went from evangelicalism to progressive Christian. I've had people like Bart Campolo, who went all the way to atheist humanist. I don't know if you know who he is, but his
Mm.
father was a famous evangelical. He was a famous evangelical, and then he deconstructed and became a humanist atheist. But he practices a love ethic. So
Sure.
so we had some disagreements on the existence of God, but we agreed on what matters most. So I have a variety of people like that on the podcast, trying to get different voices and sharing what their experience was, so people can understand other people have gone through the same thing, and hear their stories about how they're dealing with it and how they've come out and how they've rebuilt something.
Wow. Yeah. Side note, I noticed in reading your book, they were talking about something that's probably harkens back to the ancient Celtic traditions of brewing
Yeah,
beers, and how that I just liked how you made the parallel between that and basically like the Eucharist, or breaking of bread, the body and blood,
right.
and just basically breaking bread in homes and being like, and so essentially you've started kind of a spiritual community around breweries. That's kind of harkens back to
Yes,
that
right,
ancient
right.
Celtic traditions.
Well, yeah, I
My
mean,
family's Irish, so I
if
have to
Jesus, if
tip my
Jesus
hat to you
was
and say yes. I
right,
anything
if
that's anything
Jesus,
that validates me and
right,
drinking
if,
pensities,
if
No.
Jesus had lived in Ireland or Germany, then we would be drinking beer at communion.
Right.
It's just the celebratory drink of the day of the region, And so, yeah, and carrying on that tradition, but it also went into the monks. I haven't really studied, I'd love to study the Celtic tradition more, but I did look into the first monasteries and how they drank, how the monks would make beer, and they'd have three types of beer. They'd have the beer for the general community that they would sell and make some money and help fund the monastery. And then they'd have the beer that they made for themselves, probably the good stuff.
Yeah, I imagine.
And they would consume themselves. And then they had charity beer, beer for the poor.
Oh, that's lovely. Hey, even the poor need some beer every now and then, you
Exactly.
know.
Right. So,
Well, if you had been here live in person with me, I would have offered you a beer. I would
yeah,
have.
well, definitely.
I
Yeah.
would have had that
Right.
sacrament with
Right.
you,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
maybe some bourbon on the rocks, whatever your flavor is. But if
Yeah,
you sounds like you're a beer guy.
I'm a beer guy, but it's the brew of your choice, right? Definitely.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to research and study more. It's just interesting how much of like the ancient pagan Celtic beliefs were completely wiped out because of the Romans, and how much it became these like different traditions were kind of bled into Christianity. Like, I don't know, they're just things like I don't know, like this folklore kind of person called the Green Man. I don't know. It'd be just something that
Yeah.
you should check
Mhm.
out. I find it interesting. I've got a friend who practices Druidism, and so I'd like to have
Okay.
him on the show some point.
Okay. All right.
And it's kind of like a humanist / love of worship of nature
Right.
viewpoint.
Right.
Not really the animal sacrifice, but again, every religion had that at some point. Like I said, it's sailing all religions. We have to have some violence to cure our problems,
I know.
like,
Really. It's true.
but for the most part, it's like, hey, we're just gathering medicines from the earth and learning how to cohabitate with, the environment. And sounds like a beautiful kind of new take on it. But it's interesting because, yeah, so much of that information was lost because of the conquest of ancient, yeah, invasions and stuff that happened
Right. Right.
in the Celtic countries. But
Yeah.
I digress.
No, it's fascinating to discover those things, those traditions that are kind of lost or been, held back from your typical history books.
Yeah, there's a show I was going to mention too, just in that same vein of just like, feeling like we have an idea of what's been passed down to us, but really having no idea. There's this new show. They're not a sponsor, so this is just a freebie for Apple TV. But it's a show called Silo. You should check
Okay.
it out. But
All
it's
right. Silo.
basically, 10,000 people stranded in a silo, and they don't know why they're there. But
Mhm.
basically, they have a whole civilization underground, and they just know that outside the silo, it's toxic. That
Oh, okay. Right.
that the earth has been somehow polluted. So they have like every now and then these ancient artifacts will arise, like a hard drive or a these
Oh,
things, and people don't know what they are because it's been like a couple 100 years, 300 years or something since like that time of their ancestors, they call them.
right. Right.
But it's a pretty interesting show as far as just like that idea of like just the idea of how religious control there's actually no religious aspect of the show at all. But it's very parallel, I feel like, in the metaphor of like, well, this is what's always been passed down to us, and anybody who doesn't turn in these artifacts are heretics and they must
Oh,
be
I
turned
see.
in.
I see.
And it's this control of information. But it's just amazing how just the idea of like, oh, it only takes 200 or 300 years to be told that this is what this thing is and this is what's always been. And you called it Christmas now, but it used to be called Christmas. I don't know, like,
Right. Right. Yeah.
I don't know. That's just it just kind of shows you how much we don't know. And I really like the show. So if you're in
Yeah.
that mood, if you want that kind of like mind bending
Yeah. I'll
kind
have
of
to check
thriller
it out.
show,
Sounds interesting.
it's a fun show. Michael, tell us, with the release of your new book, you're going to be doing so many book tours coming up, or you got projects
Yeah,
you're working on this year?
I got. I'm going to be speaking at the Wild Goose Festival next weekend. I don't know if you're listening to this; it might have already happened.
Yeah.
But July 13th through 16th, and I'm going to talk about my book and have a couple sessions. I'm starting to book some events. I'm going to have a book launch party in August. I'm going to speak at a Unitarian Universalist church in September. So I'm starting to get some speaking gigs around the ideas of the book. But also podcasts, a lot of podcasts like yours, et cetera, and social media. But so far the response has been really good. If you want to learn more about the book, you can find it on Amazon, and there's some reviews, and the reviews keep coming in. There's more there. There's a lot of reviews, but not all of them are populated in Amazon yet. But most of the response has been absolutely blown me away. What people have said, what the endorsers have said, and just hearing people comment on what they've gotten out of the book. And so also it's selling pretty well so far. So
Congrats, man.
I'm really amazed that it's actually #1 in a new release and in sales for several categories, for 2 categories in particular. But anyways, you find it on Amazon. You can find more about what I'm doing and what I have a deconstruction workshop. I have a deconstruction support group, and you can find that as well as information about the book on spiritualbrewpub.com, as well as my podcast.
Yeah. Well, congratulations again. And it sounds like if we ever meet up in person, dinner's on you. Is that what I'm hearing? With the good book sales, I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah. No, definitely a couple beers, if not dinner. No.
Yeah, you could give me one of those beers that the monks give the
right.
to the poor people.
I'll give you a couple of charity beers.
Yeah, give me a charity beer. Yeah, that's what with your classic. Yeah, it would be wonderful.
Works for me.
Well, good luck with your speaking engagements and your upcoming conference. And go ahead one more time for folks throughout your website and social media channels where people can check out.
Yeah, spiritualbrewpub.com. And you can search for me on Facebook, Michael Camp. And I have a Patheos blog. You can search on patheos.com for Michael Camp. So also Instagram as well.
Spiritual Brew Pub.
Yep.
Well, thanks again for being here, Michael, and for sharing about your book and just overall their depth of knowledge and helping people navigate their spiritual path post deconstruction. And I know it's meant a lot to me. Thanks for your advanced copy of the book. I plan to finish it. Like I said, I didn't have time to quite finish it before we had our interview, but really illuminating stuff there. And
thank you.
Folks, to check out Pray for Micah Pod on all your socials, smash that like button, leave the comments, leave the reviews, give it a 5-star, check out the Spiritual Brew Pub, give them 5 stars, just to make all the algorithm gods happy. Show them that you don't believe in retribution, you believe in the path of peace, so make it all kosher. Until next time. Thanks for joining me for the Pray for Micah podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review, and check out my YouTube channel and follow me on social media. Pray for Micah Pod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. We'll see you next time.
You are now re-entering the normal world.